Thank you for taking the time. I really enjoy these opportunities, particularly because having worked as a coaching on campus for the last 6 years, I really enjoy the one-on-ones and being able to work with students. But I also find that, having this opportunity to particularly reach out beyond those individual sessions to be able to provide some basic information or some other, and be able to maybe provide you a framework or a groundwork for which you can approach a sort of a career in intelligence or in national security from there. Okay. So just to give a little bit more background in terms of my experience and where I've come to. This is not really to talk about my resume so much, or to highlight my prestigious career, but mostly just give you a perception on how my perspective on my background and how I approach this. So I was a graduate. I went to Georgetown undergraduate at School of Foreign Service, served 4 years as an Army infantry officer. At least 6 months of that, or almost a year in that in Afghanistan. After that time, that's where I began my work at the Defense Intelligence Agency for about a decade. So worked in Washington, D.C. here at Bolling Air Force Base at the IA headquarters as an all-source analyst, but then transitioned to be able to work in the field to help support collection operations over in Tokyo, Japan, which was a fantastic experience. And it was a fantastic area to both live in and work in, particularly during that time. After that, I then got out of that, and like anything else, being a third-year NFL quarterback kind of like thing, where I came back to DIA and I'm looking for something more. So I took another position within an organization called the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, which is within the Department of Defense. And then after that, decided I was going to, my career in government was done for the time being. Picked up some other things, and particularly worked as a contractor within USDI. I also run my own coaching business and have worked in a couple of startups, and then a screenwriter by trade. All that is to say is not to tell you about my story, is more about the fact of that there is no one path to get in. And there's actually one of those ways of, thinking about as you're over this whole process, and we'll get into this a bit more, thinking about the length of your career and the various skills that you can bring to bear for this. So that's kind of how I approach it. I'm kind of a weird bird in that you're not going to find too many. Everybody's got their own background. So the objective really today, what I really want to focus on is really help you provide is a framework. I'm not going to give you a lot of detailed data of that because there's a lot of resources online and things. But the one thing I find with these sessions is it's really helpful to think about helping you reframe or give you some tools to how to approach the process. So the first and ultimate thing we want to talk about is how to decide if this career is right for you. One of the things I always like to say with this is that, there's more of this process that, this is not so much of finding a job as you're finding a career. In many cases, and sometimes, particularly with the realm of the intelligence community, it's kind of more like pledging a sorority or a fraternity. It's much more about fit. In fact, it has its own hazing program called the Polygraph, which we can talk about at some point for those who didn't, but nevertheless, it has the same hallmarks of it. So really the focus up front is for you to find what's the right fit for you. Part of that is then finding the options that are available, because many people know some of the big ones like collection officer or operations officer, but there are other things out there, and I'll help you provide some of the things you may not consider. And then how to talk about how to position yourself for this process and success. So, but I always like to start off with one of these things is that there's a simple truth to this, getting this job or starting this career. Getting a job in the intelligence field is extremely hard. This is one of those things where it's just as simple a fact, the numbers are to bear this out, that it's extremely competitive, and it's a really difficult process to get through all the various wickets you have to. But at the end of the day, it's supposed to be. And the reason I say that is not because it may not be the reason you think, because obviously we want to be able to, as an intelligence community and national security organization, you want to be able to be very you want to be sure you're picking the right people, because obviously you're dealing with very highly sensitive information. You don't really necessarily want to disclose adversaries and all that other stuff. But there's kind of an unintentional genius to the process of this, because I think in terms of particularly the people who make up who are successful in this career, it's one of those things as you think about this is, as you are sitting there where you can, as you're projecting yourself and how do I get inside the community, it seems like a very dense fog and cloud. You'll get bits and pieces of information out of that. You're trying not sure what's true, what is not true. Is this like how it is? And really at the end of the day, you're going to only get partial pieces of that information, which you have to put together as part of your application process and deliver essentially that is something compelling and alluring to the hiring managers. But one of the things with that is, if you really think about it, is in order to get the job, you're really doing the intelligence job. You're doing your work. And then ultimately, if you're uncomfortable with the process of getting into the intel community, it's one of those things where you might actually have problems with the job. So one of the things to think about, and I always like to say, is like, in order to get the job, you have to do the job. Think of this as an intelligence problem. What you're facing and all the things that you're going to bring to bear to get through this process are the many of the hallmarks you're going to have to do in the job. So why not start now and look at it from that way? So now getting into some of the basic informations, there are really three pillars of the intel community career or there. One is the collection and analysis side. The other side, which people don't really think about too much, is on the counterintelligence side. So in collection and analysis, we're focused on gaining access to secrets from the adversary, whereas the counterintelligence, you're really focused on preventing the adversary from gathering information or intelligence on us. It's one of those things. And the third pillar, which is much smaller, is on the covert action side, which is really relegated to a very small number in terms of that, and it's really very rare that is your entree into the intel community. So one of the things I have to say is up front is, and we're going to talk a little bit about the various roles. I think the biggest thing and the number one question you always have is, and oftentimes in conversations I have with students, is the first question is like, okay, where should I apply? Well, the first question shouldn't be where should I apply? It's actually what role should you be? Because ultimately that's what you're trying to do. Again, find the fit. And what you have to figure out are, the core question that I always come back with this is, what makes a great X? What do you know about the different roles? What are those hallmarks of those? And are those hallmarks, or are those elements that make a great analyst, for instance, are those what you also carry? So if you think about an analyst, the analyst's job is ultimately, as a strategic thinker, is a big sort of the broader array. You sit mostly in Washington, although there are the other intel centers and wherever they are. And then basically your job is to gather up the various pieces of information to answer a customer requirement. So it could be someone who is a military commander, it could be a senior policymaker, it could be something who have a core question about whatever that topic is. And then your job is to either plan, or not only plan the process of identifying and how to gather the information, collect, and be able to work with collectors who are out there gathering to put those pieces together and then deliver what is called finished intelligence products to policymakers. So who makes a great analyst? Generally, in my experience, and everybody comes to this conclusion themselves, are people who are, critical thinkers, strategic in their mindset in terms of, hey, how do I think about this dynamically, really dig down, or are very curious about the world that they're looking at. And not only about that in terms of, and curious in the ways of which, the new ways to look at it. But ultimately, when it comes down to a lot of what the job is you're excellent communicator in terms of being able to take very complex situations, very nuanced situations, and be able to deliver that either verbally or written in a very cogent and concise manner. So your ability to think broadly, strategically, but be able to deliver and very tightly is a key part of what makes a great analyst. If on the one side of the barbell is the analyst, the other side, thinking in big picture, the other side is the collector. And we think in terms of, I'm talking most specifically about the human collector, particularly. What I always say is, I have a number of conversations with students or alumni who come in and say, I'm either I'm destined to, or I really want to be a human collector. And my first question is really, what do you think that job is? And at the end of the day, what I always like to say is the focus of that job is, your job is to basically be out in the field, identify people with placement of access to information that is valuable to the United States. Your job is then to develop a relationship with that individual, be able to find out everything that makes them tick, what their proclivities are, what their vulnerabilities, and then manipulate that relationship to a point where they betray their country, commit a crime, and provide that information to the United States government. Many cases, that's a key thing, and to think about is, everyone thinks in the James Bond aspects, but that's really the core about it, is developing relationships, manipulating that relationships to the point where they become assets in which they can be able to do that. So in order to do that work, it requires a couple things. One is whereas rather than being broad, that's where you're very highly focused on very targets of interest of that. You have to be extremely intellectually agile, be comfortable in ambiguous situations. and really understand with, that in many cases you're living in a hostile environment 24 hours a day. It is a lifestyle. It is not a job. You do not check out of that. In many cases, in my experience with case officers, particularly, they don't really turn it off, which can be annoying at more than one time. But at the end of the day, one of the other aspects that they demonstrate is being extremely resilient and resourceful about how to be able to, because they're never one of those things. It's a numbers game. Yes, you can find people but the people who have the most sensitive secrets don't exactly make themselves known, don't exactly are pretty well predisposed to, protect against those things. So your job is to overcome those obstacles and be able to achieve your objective. So if those are two barbells, you think about an analyst on the one side and you talk about a collector on the other side, they're actually the two very different people in many contexts. Some people can do both, but in many cases, they kind of fall within those realms, or at least the beginning portions of it. In between, there are a number of very valuable and exciting roles, actually, that help around the spectrum. So if you think about the analysts who need to gather information of it, your job as a collection manager, in some cases, depending on what organization you're working with, its job as collection managers is to bridge the gap between the analyst and the collectors. So the analysts will want a time, mostly because their customers will say, hey, tell me everything about, this topic. That's not a realistic type of thing where a collector can go out and either task or source or something like that effect to be able to do that. So a collection manager has to take those very specific gaps and requirements and be able to translate to the collector saying, hey, this is what they really need or what they really want. And then and match those up with the sources that are available to do that. Correspondingly, if you start from the other side, the job is the case officers, operations officers don't work alone. They're part of a team, and their jobs are, particularly with the targeter and desk officers, or in CIA parlance, they'll call it a SOOS, staff operations officer. Those individuals from a targeter context, their job is to find those people with placement and access, develop those portfolios or dossiers with those people for those people, and enable those and provide that information so that it can be used for developing sources. Desk officers or SOOs are mostly in charge of the care and feeding, a lot of the report writing, a lot of budget, a lot of logistics, other things, aspects like that. So the key part of that, your key enabler to all those operations, you're part and parcel of it, and very much a part of the overall operation. So people are there, the briefers or methodologists, legal stuff. There's any number of jobs that are available there to it. So it really comes down to, but most either fall within the operations or analysis. But nevertheless, there's something to think about as you enter, but also as you go throughout your career, is how well do you want to pivot and position yourself over time? Because I'll give you my example is I've played them in many cases. I've played one of these roles, except the legal one, because I'm not charged with nor have any interest in doing that. So as a result of that, being able to go through each of those things and see, okay, what is the best fit for you? So if they're talking about roles, let's talk a little bit about what are options that are available. So the first question that we identified you is, someone who has an interest and proclivity and is going to be a great analyst someplace. So then the next spot is to start talking about the various organizations that do this. The first and foremost is we talk a lot about the intelligence community, which are 17 organizations that across that are government organizations that are charged with this one. And we'll walk through a little bit about it, and a little bit about the culture. And I think that's the key piece of this is we want to talk about it. So the first one is obviously the Central Intelligence Agency. I always like to joke, the fact is that they are the premier intelligence organization on the planet. All you have to do is ask them; they'll tell you the exact that is so. But the Central Intelligence Agency is obviously one of the biggest behemoths on the block. They have an enormous amount of legacy, prestige, resources, and aspects, and is one of those places that if you are particularly in the realm of dealing with either leadership, focus on military capabilities to technical analysis, they cover the gambit of it and are pretty much are a key force within that organization. So obviously that's one that everybody knows. The other 800-pound gorilla in the intelligence community is the National Security Agency. That's very focused on, in many cases, everybody thinks about the be able to technical collection, both in terms of signals, and being able to collect information, communications intelligence, other types of things, that data that put together. But as a massive organization is critical to everything. But I would say is that's a single entity, so something to think about. So whereas CIA has a multi-int mission where they can put together humans with technical collection and analysis, the National Security Agency itself is largely focused on thinking about, how do they be able to collect what they can read or they hear, and with increasing. So that is the focus for them, but nevertheless are a key part of when they publish things that they're largely basically collection single int. The next one is the Defense Intelligence Agency, one place that I'm a proud alumni of. It's one of those places that is unlike I would say carries a lot of the same mission sets and serves the same customers that the CIA does, but is a little smaller in terms of scope as well. So whereas the CIA, you could be a small fish in an NSA to that effect, a small fish in a very, very large pond. DIA, you're a little small when you first begin. And one of the things I appreciated with it was you're a small fish in a smaller pond. You had a lot more ability, at least I found, to take control of your career over the time, identify people and build those relationships and be able to direct, hey, where do I want to go? What do I want to do? And a little bit there. So it's one of those places that I always like to say is like, yes, everybody, there's the CIA, NSA, DIA also does a lot of the very similar. They do write for the president. They do write for the Secretary of Defense, as well as military commanders. So if that is something of your ilk and interest, it's another place to consider. One place that I also like to highlight is a place that doesn't really get a lot of interest, but I find is doing some of the most exciting work in the intelligence community is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, or NGA, formerly NEMA back in the old days. People think about this, we used to call them squints because they used to lean over these light tables and basically peer through on things. But the days that has happened, or that's been main focus of their mission, is long gone. Someone who a close friend of mine who works there says that their number one competitor in reality is Google, because what's happening is geospatial intelligence, as we see it, when you do Google Maps or Waze or things like that, that's the open source side of it. It's the same type of thing where they are now fusing like the geography or the geo stuff with the other data that comes in and be able to paint a more robust picture about what is occurring in the places of interest. Not to mention the fact, I will tell you that every single brief that I see, everybody loves their pretty pictures. The power of the word. If you are a very visual person that likes to be able to paint or show or tell stories, particularly through visual means, NGA is a great place to work in terms of being able to cutting edge with a lot of that. And then the other side of it is you think about, is the FBI. So but there are some distinct things. When I first began about 20 years ago, FBI was very much a criminal, looking for the criminal portions. That was their job. They're a law enforcement organization. So they usually were speaking, when you think about law enforcement, it's mostly, hey, a crime was committed. I got to go back and do the investigation to find out what happened. So it's very backward looking. Increasingly, though, FBI's ploy, particularly in the counterintelligence realm, is their one of their main efforts and contributions to the IC, is much more proactive. They're, in terms of their ability to, and their play in a number of different ways, is helping to, fight the fight as the borders and what we're finding today, whether it be foreign influence to cyber to any type of thing, they're playing an integral part across the board. So one thing also to say is, and think about, and one is the nomenclature a little bit is different. So if you are an analyst at CIA or DIA, it's a little bit different than what it is at FBI. Whereas FBI, if you're an IA or intelligence analyst, most likely you are more akin to a targeter or a collection manager or a CMO that is working side by side along agents in the field at the field offices, helping develop cases or being able to support. It's a little more tactical in that realm of that. So something to think about in terms of how they define it, and it's mostly that. But nevertheless, it's one of those aspects where, an IA is a critical piece of that and has been growing as a career field within the FBI. So Department of State is another one not many people consider, but nevertheless has their main effort with it is state, what's called INR, Intelligence and Research. It is one of those places. It's kind of, I always akin, it's very small. Kind of like the Supreme Court. You got to wait till someone passes on before you can get a spot there. But nevertheless, the work that they do is pretty incredible in terms of, and have in many cases, if you read those the declassified intelligence, you find many cases their analysis is spot on. So it is something to play, particularly being able to inform the interagency piece of that. And then Homeland Security, the newest one, is still the newest one, and they talk about a sprawling mission and mandate. Covers a lot of everything from cyber to counterterrorism to anti-terrorism to any number of things. If your interest is particularly in defending the homeland and want to leverage both in terms of that your skills there, a great place to consider. So inside, when I talked about the government organizations, the next kind of the area that you want to look at potentially, because everybody wants to go through that process and get into it. And I advise is you always want to be moving towards the center of the bullseye. So if that is of interest and want to go to the intel community, you should first always try to go as for the government position entry, particularly as you're coming out of these grad programs or even undergrad programs, because they have great programs bringing people on or that. The fallback, or at least particularly within the intelligence community or in other places that you find, maybe not the front end of your career, but maybe later, is looking at the contractors. So, and there's a mix of it in terms of it. And what I have listed here are some of the big people. So Kaki, Booz Allen are some of the bigger ones. Leidos are also, they are, when you think about them, in many cases, they provide staff augmentation. So your job would be in terms of if you worked at a Booz or a Leidos or something like that, your job would be particularly serving an IC client. You'd have many cases, you'd be working side by side with the government people there. Your badge color would be, instead of blue, it would be green. And then being able to do many of the cases that you're doing a lot of sub parts of the work that they're doing, enabling and supporting. So that's kind of the work that they is an option there as well. A little bit tougher to do because many cases those organizations are looking for people who because they make money based on how fast they can get you in the seat and how fast they can bill. They're looking for people with, generally speaking, experience 1 to 3 years. And then have a clearance that's an active clearance. So always not the easiest way to go in the front door, but nevertheless is something to consider as you go through your progression. One other is their RAND, the world famous RAND Corporation, which I was once a member, or at least an adjunct with, also does analysis on the outside. So they do, rather than in seat, they do external analysis and provide that type of support. And then increasingly what you'll find, or at least is not considered, is really in the commercial and consultancy world. So places like Ernst & Young, PwC, Guidehouse is another one that's new. They also have done consulting work or staff augmentation to be able to support national security, intelligence, community customers. Many similar ways, but it's not the normal big defense contractors that we previously discussed. Other ones they think about as you go further, like the job of intelligence in many cases, particularly analysis, what they call, and the term they use is risk intelligence in that realm, or threat intelligence if you're in cyber realm, but threat intelligence, there's a whole lexicon that's in terms of that. You wouldn't expect, but quite frankly, like Walt Disney Company has one of the most robust commercial intelligence programs out there, as well as you can think of any oil and gas. They have to be in places that are weird places. Even places like Target are places where they have ongoing what they call global security operations centers, or GSOCs, that their job is to maintain and monitor. So some of the people I've worked with, and one group to think about is the Association of the International Risk Intelligence Professionals, ARIP. They have a job board that gives you a sense there as well, looking at any number of the places that are looking for people who can do analysis, or primarily that are looking to do that for the private sector. A lot of the same similar skills. So taking a few minutes to talk about the application process, many of you already know, but nevertheless, there's an initial application with any of those. So depends on which organization, they all have a little bit different to it, but nevertheless, they have some of the major hallmarks. So there is some, like NSA, that is very big on online testing. Like in many cases, you'll have to do an online test prior to that, like a logic or something like that. Most all have resumes and cover letters. One thing to note is that the common question I get is, do you use like the OPM or USA Jobs resume for these? In most cases, particularly if you're going straight into the Intel community, not really. And I'll talk a little bit about the resume format there. Places like CIA, to a certain extent, DIA will do, CIA particularly has what they call supplementary narrative statements, in which you have 5 questions that you have to answer, and that really want to get to the point where understanding more about you, sort of like the pre-interview type of thing. And then ultimately, we want to say, circling back a little bit, cover letters are critical, particularly when it comes to CIA and others, because it is the first opportunity they have for you to make that pitch to them. So after you go through that, obviously that process, you're looking at interviews. When it comes down to, when I talk about it, is because, again, the overarching unified theory with this process is that it's more like they're looking for fit. Interviews are critical. They want to know what drives you, why are you applying to this field, that organization. That is the number one thing they're walking away from. That process is they want to see what your motivation is and how do you get through, and why is that the right fit for you? Have you done that due diligence on your own side in preparation? So then they have background investigation. So everyone has to do an EKIP or SF86, and then they do depending on where you are, if you're doing a single scope or what's it called, a full scope background investigation. That includes both, not only talking to your friends and neighbors, looking at your financial history and other activities. They'll also have to do a drug test and a polygraph, which is always fun. So some of the things I want to talk about is, like, again, use an example we've used previously, at least at Georgetown, is like the 1-page resume for that. It's different than the OPM, for instance, and some have different things. CIA likes to perhaps have an objective statement many times. One thing that's not here on this example is they like to call out leadership portions. So focus again on your leadership. The one thing else I will highlight, again, coming much more generally in the coaching side of things, there's that portion in the resume that says experience. My opinion on this one is, although you don't actually literally do that, one way to think about is crossing that word out, experience, and thinking about it in terms of what was your impact. How were the organizations you served or worked with better for you having been there? That should be ultimately one of the things you want to focus on in standard. So what that means is, ultimately, when it comes down in practical terms for the bullets that you're doing, is don't relay or recount what you did. Talk about why it mattered. Like, who did it deliver to? Give me a sense of scope. Give me a sense of, how far, what did you deliver it to? A number of customers. Did you go to, was it to deliver to someone important, or that type of thing? Want to paint that picture of why that is something that, it mattered to the people that you're working with. And ultimately, if you can, talk about how you have made improvements there as well. So then the final is the cover letter. It's again, one of the best parts of, one of the most important parts of this process, the application process, is to actually gives you a sense that you can make a connection. It's your first time, whereas the resumes is a recounting of what you've done and what you bring to the table. This is where you start putting the packaging together, and just like a good analyst, being able to take all the various pieces of parts of your experience and put it together in a cogent statement, or and making a case for yourself. So one I always like to talk about with cover letters is, again, if it's a sales document, go with figuring out, how do you build rapport? Talk about them, making the case that you understand their needs and why you'll actually be able to fit. Then you can talk about defining your qualifications, and then wrap up and all those. And, that's the kind of thing we take a look at more deeply later. So again, time. One of the unique features of this process is, because of the security, is that the time is going to be extended. So if you have a question, or you have a feel like, should I wait to apply until there's something perfect, I would always advocate apply earlier than later. When the moment you think is ready and right, that's the time that you should make that application. Do not try to basically glide slope this into a perfect time of, hey, a certain graduation date or something to that effect. That makes it pretty difficult. average now for security clearances, and some aspects are going faster, like they'll, in terms of the actual physical part of talking to your people in the background check, that's going faster because they just do it more over the phone, less than in person. But the adjudication process takes a lot longer. So I would say Kentucky windage, if you were, guessing, if you think 9 months, realistically, probably a year. So as you go, that's the kind of thing, is one of those processes you have to, hey, this is what I'm making the application for, and then, almost set it and forget it and going on to looking at other options that are available. So one of the things I always like to say is that particularly with this process, it's very hard for many people who are trying to apply because they've seen this and this is want to be their job or their career, and this is what they've envisioned themselves doing for many, many years. The real focus for it is sometimes it's hard this process is about you, but it's not personal. I have found in my experience with this is that what this chart shows is sort of where the breakdown of where I think the most important parts of this are. So obviously your intelligence, your intellectual capacity, that plays a significant role, but a lot of people are very smart and very talented on that. Your knowledge of global affairs, also a key consideration, but really only accounts for about 10%. A big portion of it is really about your emotional intelligence, how mature you are, how knowledgeable about who you are, and your sort of ability to work with, and mostly a lot of times work with a team, a high performing team in a very stressful environment, whether it be here in Washington or over the field. So your ability to have command of your emotions, and willing to connect and be, that is a huge part of which they're going to suss out through that entire application process, or particularly in the interviews. But one other thing I find about it is, many cases, when the reason you're successful or not successful has nothing to do with you. In many cases, it could be something else completely outside your control or command. So that's one of those things where I always advocate is you approach this process with a little bit of certainty, but also a little bit of humility and flexibility, is recognize that, hey, I'm going to do my best effort here, but there's a lot of other things. And essentially it goes back again to, in order to get the job, you got to do the job. Sometimes you're going to have to show resilience and resourcefulness, and that's how you're going to have to get through. And you have to push, try to push over the vending. It takes a couple pushes to get the vending machine over. Maybe that's the case for you. It doesn't always, and that's the key, is if this is something that you really want to do, you have to make that commitment. So some of the resources that are available out there, intelligencecareers.gov is a great one. They provide a lot of basic information on that. USA Jobs gives you another great sense, obviously, of mid-career positions, although some initial ones, particularly like State Department type of internships, will go through that. Clearance jobs are mostly focused, if you have a clearance already, it's a great resource to be able to find what's also available. And there's a couple books that I recommend, or at least I've read. Some do better, but the Startup of You is a good one to talk more about your sort of approach broadly of how do you define and sort of chart your way through a career that applies to this as well. But one of the things as a slight plug here is one of the things is, I have a team of coaches that I work with under at natseccareers.com. That come from both public and private sector experience as well. So we have a number of podcasts on there that we're continuing to develop. We're doing a number of things and looking at other resources that you may be of useful to you as well. So particularly in some of the topics when we talk about, like, for instance, what makes a great case officer, what makes a great analyst, those are available there. So we have a number of guests and something else to consider. So with that, that's pretty much my presentation in terms of, finding your career, or at least to try to get your started into it. And happy to take any questions that you have at this point.
Yeah, thank you. So again, everybody, if you want to message me your questions via the chat function, and let me know if you want to remain anonymous or not. I do have one question from a student, and this person says, as somebody that is not currently studying data science or computer science, how important is it to develop those technical skills like programming, et cetera?
So I always say it is The technical skills in which you develop are important in and of that depend. I'll take this. It depends on what you're applying for. If you're going through something or trying to be specifically a data science within it, obviously that's important. What I would say is it's like a foreign language. When you approach this, particularly this one, you want to become a certain comfort level. Like if you want to be a China analyst, you got to get to a level where you don't have to be fluent in Chinese, but getting to the point where you don't mispronounce the names is kind of important. Those skills, if that's something you want to go and you feel that's the future, developing that to the point where you feel is great. I don't advocate doing it just because you think it makes you more competitive or get to a specific job. But I would say, is this something that if you want to add your toolkit such that, when you want to, you feel you can be conversant and can see and unlock the power of those tools, that's important to be able to display. But it's the same thing like if going to like a security plus or some type of cybersecurity type of thing. If you're doing it just to add it to the resume, that's not the most critical thing for when going through this process. Because really, again, they're trying to evaluate who you are or who you be versus what you know and what's on your resume necessarily, what tickets you got. So if it's of interest and you find it interesting and think it could be advantageous, by all means, but it's not something I would just try to use as gamify it a little bit or try to play the game a bit.
Yeah, thank you. And I know with some of our other recruiters that I've spoken with is they also look for students of a wide variety of majors and backgrounds because there's a lot of studies out there that have proven when you have people of differing expertise and you put them all together in the room, they're better able to predict like an outcome or a solution to a problem than, I'll say like a whole group of like, coders who know nothing but code. And you add in a little bit of variation to the mix and you're often able to uncover something that you may not have because you think differently than other people.
Yeah, and it's not even just in the substantive or your background in terms of what you're bringing knowledge wise. It's also like where the real movement is building multifunctional teams. So thinking about putting analysts alongside collectors, alongside targeters and things, and being equipped to be able to translate across and being flexible, adaptable like that is extremely valuable to this point, where everybody is, particularly like CIA or DIA, are moving to this mission-centric concept where they do have those where you have that mixed jumble. So being able to know your discipline and know your background, but also being able to work with a disparate set of people from across functions is also important.
Thank you. So another question I have is, how did going into the military after undergrad help prepare you for working in the intelligence community?
Well, on some level, personal is like, so when you graduate Georgetown, being somewhat fluent in Chinese and then go into the U.S. Army Infantry in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, I didn't really appreciate that very much because they didn't really use that, not too many at that time. So it was kind of an interesting transition with that. In terms of getting into the Intel and how did it prepare me, I thought it was extremely valuable on a couple levels. One is obviously the basic leadership and discipline piece of that was critical. Nowhere I have found is particularly Army, where you as a 22-year-old are given such a breadth of charge and responsibility. It causes you to grow up particularly very quickly. But I would say, functionally speaking, it has helped me because I am at least understand what is this all about. In my view, you look at the Intel community and the mission that it serves. It does a number of things, but one of the most sacred missions is to help support the warfighter. That's a concept with many people who is you have to learn what that really means. The stuff that you do and the things that you write have consequences in some level. I only point to weapons of mass destruction and that situation. So what I would say is what it prepared me, one is for me, it made me more mentally and prepared to be able to take on or equipped to do that. Two is it showed me, gave me a grounding of the mission and purpose. But the third is, I think, and functionally is, it's also, again, it's a community unto itself. I have any number of people I've run into and now serving within the, some days in the Pentagon, I'll run into people that are either because in the Army and background or have some affinity to that. I connect with them. I know how to talk to them. I know how to know what their need and their worldview are. So it gives me a perspective on one of the customers that I'm serving. So that's how I would say it is something that, yeah, I mean, yeah, I got to play around in the dirt a little bit, and at the time seemed odd, but looking back particularly in the Afghanistan, my period there was sucked while was doing it, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. So
Great. Thanks. Another question, a quick one, is are federal resumes essentially the standard format for all of these agencies? And I think
so
it's a good question to clarify.
Yeah. So my experience has, for the most part, particularly if you're going from a graduate program into these new or either undergrad program through these distinct recruiting programs they are not looking for the standard federal resume. So if you're applying through OPM or applying through USA Jobs, for many cases, they're like 9s, 10s, 13 level type of position. Yes, that's where you use the federal resume. But ultimately, what you do is go with the guidance that is on their website. I know for like DIA and CIA or even NSA, they're not interested necessarily in the federal resume portion of it. So, but that's where I would say go with whatever the direction is provided there. But as you get up in career, eventually you'll have to run into where you will be using that federal resume, particularly if you're going to jump between agencies at a higher level.
Yep, and just for some of you, I'm putting something in the chat. We have a page on Handshake behind our firewall that has some examples, including a guide written by our former CIA recruiter as to like what they're looking for in a CIA resume, and there's also some tips for like versus an FBI resume.
Right.
And even in terms of like length, like I think FBI wants a 1-page resume, CIA says 1-page front and back. So,
right.
Okay. Another question is, and then of course, yeah, just kind of looking at another question, everything should always be tailored for the organization and the job that you're applying for. So like on the CIA's website, there's a lot of information about the different job types that you can apply for, as much as you can find. So yes, if you're looking to be, an analyst, a foreign language analyst, like go to the website, read what that's looking for and tailor your resume to that, versus being like a collections officer for the FBI. Like you're going to you always tailor as much as you can. Yeah. Like Mike was saying, it's a cloudy world where you don't know everything, but they do give a lot on their websites.
Yeah. I would say also is like the first, again, going back to that first question, ask yourself what makes it, based on what you read there, or at least what you intuitively can draw conclusions from what you've seen. Ask yourself what makes a great X, and jot down the 3 or 4 things that either something of knowledge or who you be or those aspects of it. Those 3 or 4 like principle or attributes, and therefore then tailor your resume and your cover letter highlighting those. Use those as the framework for there that touches upon that, because ultimately, well, that's what they're looking for. They're going to be looking, hey, well, here are the things what I think is great, and I'm looking for someone who that jumps off on the page for me. So, oh, you're muted.
Okay. Another question is, Mitchell asks, a common question in an interview is about one's weaknesses, vulnerabilities, or failure. How can one answer such a question without ruining your chances?
By number one, being authentic, and tailoring it to something where you can describe not only a situation that it played into, but how does it make you better for being a better candidate, whether you're an analyst or a collector or something to that effect. Some people want to approach it, or there's 2 ways to approach it. One is being overly confessional, okay, but really what they're trying to do is trying to understand from you is how equipped are you to do that, how self-aware are you, and how confident are you to do that evaluation of your own performance over your life, and then say, hey, here are the mistakes I've made, or in this case, and then describe, what you've learned. So even in that context, we use the STAR system: situation, task, action, result, and those types of things as a framework is a good way to do it. But ultimately talk about and looking at your greatest weakness isn't, don't ever say the word, I try too hard or whatever. That's not, they're going to see right through that. That's not helpful. What is helpful is for you to be able to have something that is of relative importance of a position in your life where you've had to make a tough choice, particularly, or you've made a choice where based on incomplete information or something of that effect, and be able to say, how did you handle that setback and move on from it or become better to it, without knowing the circumstances or that. I don't know, but that's a common question we get, particularly in the coaching sessions that I have. In many cases, that's where it's great to workshop it with somebody to say, okay, what is your impression of it? But also in the fact of is being honest and forthright, and being confident about it. If you're embarrassed by it or things like that, okay, obviously, but it's one of those things where, it's an important question because they're going to want to know, how have you handled adversity or mistakes and gotten better for it.
Great. And we have another good question. Do most IC agencies have opportunities for continued learning, like language training, etc.?
Yes, undoubtedly. In fact, some places will not only pay for your training, but they'll also give you additional incentives pay for, depending on how well your foreign language are, for that, as well as other continuing learning. I'd say particularly like CIA and DI has gotten a lot better in terms of that, being able to enhance your skills, give you opportunities. You can go to places like, for my instance, I went to the Joint Warfare, went to not the National War College, but my goodness, I'm blanking on it. But nevertheless, it's one of those, but basically joint warfare centers, analysis center, for training and things like that. It's a constant. They're trying to enhance your skills because ultimately they're invested in you. For 30 years. They're not just here for a job. So.
Yep, and they also have, I know each agency manages it differently, but there are master's degree programs that you can take through some of the intelligence community or defense agencies.
Yep.
So you can get your master's in a subject. And it's unique in that you have to do all your work on site. It's classified. It's not quite like taking a master's with like GW or American or Georgetown. But there is that option as well. But you have to be a high performer to
National Intelligence University is a great place.
Yeah, it's a beautiful campus too. Over kind of by the wharf. Yes, are there IC agencies besides state's INR office that do not require polygraphs?
Not that I'm aware of. Most that touch on or deal with sensitive compartmented information, or SCI, require a polygraph, or at least at one point. There are any number of other elements within the national security, so in defense or things like that, that don't. But nevertheless, the vast majority in the IC you'll undoubtedly have to go through the polygraph.
And then another good question: how easy is it to transfer between different IC agencies once you get into one? Are the skills transferable?
Skills are transferable. It's a matter of, I wouldn't say it's easy. I would say it depends on how you approach it. So there are two ways to do, particularly in your earliest stages of career. You want to spend a lot of time in getting to become a master of your trade craft and things like that. But the one thing is, you also have to invest in not only mastering the substantive work and how you do the work, but also building your network so that you can build beyond that. You want to get to the point where, at least at some point, if you do want to make a change, much more once you're on the inside, leverage your access now to figure out, hey, is CIA really a place I want to work? Do I like the people that I'm working with that would be working with there? And then try to make that move. So I would say it's not as easy. There are no real barriers to doing that, but in many cases, what you have is just like anything else. You get in with an organization, you can either within DIA, for instance, like analysis, you can get stuck in there if you wanted to and allow yourself. But if you do the work and be able to build the relationships beyond that to see what's out out there and willing to make that uncomfortable jump, because there's going to be some discomfort going from DIA to CIA. There is some culture change to it. Going from like a multi-int from DIA to a single int like NGA, also some culture change. So it's not difficult. It's something that is one of those where you have to, it's like anything else, prepare and work for it and figure out, hey, how do you put yourself, how do you best position yourself or get for that opportunity if should it present itself.
Yeah. Thank you. And I know when I was speaking, I think it was the NGA recruiters who were talking about, and this is not just for intelligence, but in the government in general, there are a lot of leadership development programs and opportunities that, especially as you get higher and get into more leadership, you can do what's called a detail, where you get assigned to a different agency, and part of the point is to expose you to another agency and its culture, and you bring what you know about your agency to that agency, and then they usually send someone in reverse. So there's leadership development opportunities like that, especially as you get more senior. So now I'm starting to get a couple more questions. This one is specific to the polygraph. What kinds of, and maybe we could expand this a little bit to like the background clearance investigation process, but what kinds of things are asked in a polygraph, and how in depth do they go?
So I'm a little limited on what I'm willing to share on that. Mostly because my job isn't to help you beat the polygraph. My job is basically to get to a point in the mental state where you're prepared for that as a coach. I would just say is, generally speaking, they're going to ask you very much. Like if you're in a single scope one, what they call a CI polygraph, they're really ultimately asking questions related to how many of the questions that if not all the questions, are what you're going to find on your SF-86. Do you have unreported foreign contacts or things like that? But they're mostly just focused, again, on the CI side of it is, have you been truthful and forthright in what you've declared and things like that, or do you have any prone vulnerabilities that can there? Now, when you get to the full scope, they're much more interested in your lifestyle, and they call a lifestyle polygraph. Again, those are things and questions that are related to drug use, other activities that they're going to be able to do that. At the end of the day, what I like to say is, again, it's about you, but it's not personal. The tendency, particularly when you're in there, the feeling is like, hey, they're making judgments about you, and some people react differently to that. Also, some people are react emotionally very quickly when people are, challenging them on these types of things. But the focus of the polygraph is ultimately to make sure that if you are entering that process, that you are forthright, and that anything that may be used or any vulnerability that you may have won't be used or exploited by somebody else at a later point. It's basically just in one case, in some ways it doesn't feel comfortable, but it's for your protection as well as the organization's protection. I'd approach it like that. And then at the same time, so it's not like I would always say it's not confessional, like you're going to your priest. They don't, and at the end of the day is, even though sometimes it can be contentious or, uncomfortable, the people are there just doing their job. And, don't take it. It's hard not to take it personally, but it's one of those things. So it's never comfortable. It's never fun. But it's not nothing, particularly if you're entering this in a good place. There's nothing to be afraid of either.
Okay, great. Another student has a question, and I'd say speak to this as much as you can, and then Tina and I can also speak to like our interactions with the recruiters as well. But what are some of the bigger cultural differences between the agencies that you've seen or observed? Like, you mentioned like CIA versus DIA or NGA seem very different.
Well, I'll start with NSA, for instance. One of those, historically has been the joke is, how can you tell an extroverted NSAer as they're looking at your shoelaces? And NSA is one of those things where it tend to, particularly, it's a very group-centric collective. I mean, I always joke again with NSA, whenever I show up at a meeting with them, they move in small groups of 20 to 30. It's a very big, think about what they do for a living. In that case, is they're very much they sit on the side and they observe, they listen, things like that. So it's a relatively passive. Now, I'm generalizing what I have, but nevertheless, it's a massive organization. It's very requirements driven. Everything your job that you're doing has to be meticulously tied to some requirements or things like that. And just like anything else, you're you are aggressively monitored in terms of what you're doing. So it's one of those places. CIA is different, I would say. Particularly is, again, it's an elite organization. It perceives itself as being elite, and everything. And if you, even the materials they put out, it says everything you do here matters. Okay, I don't always be the case, but nevertheless, that's the mantra that they show. Hey, you're part of the eliteness, and that you're part of the family, and that type of thing. So again, very focused on the group, elite, and that feeling for it. It stems from its days back in like the Skull and Bones, OSS type of stuff, and that really is the hallmark of it. Although increasingly very diverse these days. So, but and the second is like DIA in an aspect is much smaller. It's much more, those who are a little more military focused, and so it carries a little bit more things. So there's a little bit different on that, but it's not nearly that sort of that high pressure and that eliteness of that. The other thing with CIA particularly is one thing to consider, like a DIA, the analytical shop is actually one of the main efforts of it. They have they have a huge analytical shop, but a smaller collection side, whereas CIA is massive collection side, smaller analytical shop. So it is much more, particularly during War on Terror, it was more of a, covert action was a bigger part of what they did. So, anyway, it carries itself, it changes, but nevertheless, those are kind of the hallmarks, I would say, is it depends. And the key of it is the struggle with this process is, I mean, most of us, when we want to apply for a job or trying to evaluate where we want to work, the biggest question is, do we like the people that we're going to be working with? And that's kind of hard to do from the outside in that process. But nevertheless, it's one of those things where, as you go through your career, you get to figure out the various people there and get to find your fit.
And I'll just add, I did have an experience of being able to visit NGA as part of Recruiter Day, and like they seemed incredibly collegial, and like they kind of wore it as a badge of pride that like we are not CIA. We're way cooler than CIA. They maybe think they're the smartest, but we're the coolest. And so like they seemed a little more easygoing, but still incredibly smart. And their space down in Alexandria is amazing.
The big cruise ship in Lorton.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. It's a beautiful space.
You can see it.
Yeah. Okay, so we have time for one last question. This, I think, is a good one and kind of gets to that lifestyle piece you were speaking of. I understand with some IC positions, you cannot reveal to other people where you work or what you do. Is that the case for most positions and agencies, or are some more flexible?
Some are more flexible. So like DIA, unless you're in sensitive or a collection, most cases you can say you're DIA. CIA is less so, generally speaking. They're much more protective about that because it also depends on where you are in your career. So if you're starting out, you want to maintain optionality. So sometimes you want to be an analyst, but you want to go overseas and you may have to use those cover or something like that. So what they say is they generalize, you want to be circumspect about it. Now, NSA is a little bit more, has gotten better at that, but they were the same. Most of the other places, unless you're in a sensitive collection. I will say, though, the alternative to that is it gets a little difficult when, particularly if you used to say, hey, I work for the government. All right, now in this town, now you have my full attention. So you just told me who you work for. So
yeah, don't ever say that, students. You'll get guidance to say you work for the government, but in this town, like fake it and say you work for the State Department or the Treasury, and no one else will ask any questions.
Right, and then, but don't try to go so far as to say you're an accountant, and then you'll run into a CPA, and then you're in trouble. So, but all I'd say is, but it gets to the hallmark of one of the bigger issues with this is it is a lifestyle portion of it. You have to consider it. Is this something where you want, as you're entering this, knowing that in some cases, every foreigner you meet more than once you have to report? Or is it something where every time you want to travel overseas for personal business, you've got to report that 30 days in advance? Or is it something where you're constantly worried about, really thinking about what am I doing? And is this going to come up with the next polygraph, blah, 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 blah. So again, that's where the key part of this lifestyle is. And it's not just limited to like drug use or things like that, but it's a constant consideration of, and I'll also say is one thing as you think about, it's hard to not see every person that you meet. You have to go through this certain algorithm of, or at least in my mind, is who's this person? Why are they talking to me? What do I have to say and things? And it actually is funny because as I've become much more a coach and much more open and working with them, people, in terms of I've gotten the comfort to be able to figure out how to do that. It is a mystery to any number of people I work with on the other side. How is that possible? Whatever. So all I will say is you have to figure out, again, what is it palatable for that culture and what those are, what the guidance and policies are, and then figure out with the way you balance your own life, is that something you want to endure over the next course of your of years in life, and how that affects your family and other things. So those are all things to consider. But in terms of a lifestyle, it's very manageable.
One quick question, if you still have time,
Sure.
Mike. I did get, just kind of based off that question, how is this for a lifestyle if you have a family or hope to have a family someday, spouses, children? What challenges and opportunities maybe have you come across, if any?
So I would say, again, it depends on the role. But if you are mostly assigned overseas and things like that, you have to find a partner, a spouse, that is, one, supportive of what you do. Knowledgeable, I mean, may not know the details of what you do, but is supportive of the track you're on, and is willing to endure, overseas assignments, changing just like anything else, very much in a kind of military context, the constant change, venues, also having to carry in some capacity, the same security considerations and looking out who's talking to them or what have you. So that's one aspect of it. In terms of other family life, they make, um, particularly these days, they make it a priority to manage that. I will say CIA specifically, in my observations, have do really well in taking care of their people, and across the board, and as a result, have make it. But again, you are part, all of a sudden, like for a place like that, and within this, you are joining a community. You are joining, so you're not, but it's just like that. You're bringing your whole family into this, and that's where you have to have open and frank communication with your partner about what that entails, and some of the sacrifices they may have to make at some point, and position yourself at some point. You got to be able to make some space within your career to do the same. So generally speaking, it's manageable. And then you just have to have a spouse that's okay with, not knowing what I do on a day-to-day basis, but just hearing me complain about people. So, and then, so
If I can tell a really quick anecdote. So, like, you've been to CIA headquarters a bunch of times, taking students on tours, and we had an officer who was telling a story about he'd been in CIA for about 30 years, and while his wife had a general idea, his children had no idea, and still, like, to this day, they still don't know where. Well, they that's not true. He had told them the year before, and they had been moving around and just said, "Oh, well, Dad does something with state or does." Had no idea, and it wasn't until they were all adults that he told them, "Well, actually, I work at CIA," because all of the projects that he was sort of connected to were all closed, so he could now then reveal where he worked, and his children were very angry with him because they said they were not like really never. They were just like, "You had this whole time, you had this really cool job, and we thought you were just like this boring State Department guy, and we could have been telling our friends." He's like, "Well, this is why you didn't know." So it's just really interesting that he was able to share this with his wife, but still moving around. But I think, to your point, Mike, you have to have a partner who's willing to take that ride with you, and also to see your children. So
it's a you enter a world that's called, and basically everything then gets through this, on a need to know basis.
yeah.
In many cases, your spouse and partner needs to know a lot.
Yeah.
So that's really what it comes down to, and you don't want to necessarily overburden the children, particularly if you don't give them, and then now if they're not equipped, and to be able to carry that, and having to go to school and all the other things. Like, now, if you're living in Northern Virginia here, you can't swing a dead cat without running into somebody who works at any number of these agencies. So they all know the deal. So, but yeah, need to know is critical in terms of defining. And that goes to even on the front end, even as you're applying, I'll have people say, "Hey, can I even talk to you about where I'm applying?" And I was like, "Well, I already know now." But again, go with need to know. So the coaches that you work with and people are equipped to be able to, know obviously discretion and, both the ethics of coaching that we have. But if you feel that it's necessary to divulge that information so that you can get a better shot at where you want to apply, that's sort of the rubric you have to use and go with that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike, for your time today and for going through everything. We really appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.